The wind carried the first warnings long before any official declaration of threat. It slithered through cracked habitation blocks, drifted across ash-choked plains, and rattled the rusted chains that hung from abandoned manufacturer cranes. Out here, on the ragged edge of Imperial jurisdiction, nothing ever arrived with clarity. Astropaths struggled beneath the thin hum of the Astronomicon. Vox links sputtered more static than speech. Administrator messages arrived months late, if they arrived at all. For the ordinary workers and soldiers of Vardos 4, ignorance was not merely an inconvenience. It was the air they breathed. Yet even they could sense a shift in the rhythm of their world. Long before the data slates acknowledged it, it began with a vibration. One so faint that many dismissed it as the usual agitation of poorly maintained generators. But it persisted beyond that. In the barracks carved into the planet's basalt cliffs, soldiers jolted awake at night, unsure whether the tremor came from the ground beneath their bunks, or from some echo deep within their bones. Miners 100 meters below the surface stopped their drills, because they swore something unnatural was humming in the stone. And on the open tundra, where supply convoys crawled across cracked roads, drivers felt their teeth chatter with an unseen pulse that the tech adepts insisted did not exist. The unease grew until it hardened into something sharper, something that tasted like dread. Supervisors tried to enforce order with clipped shouts and threats of disciplinary action, but their own hands shook when they held their data slates. The planetary governor, a man already drowning in overdue reports and failing infrastructure, dismissed every rumor that landed on his desk. He insisted that the people were merely succumbing to paranoia, just another byproduct of living too far from terror's warmth. But even he flinched when the sky flashed an unnatural shade of green one night. A brief pulse of sickly light that crept across the horizon like a wound tearing open. The next day, the governor ordered an immediate increase in Astra Militarum patrols. Regiments marched through the manufactured districts with their lascans held tight, their boots striking in forced rhythm. Civilians lined the streets in uneasy silence as officers barked clipped reassurances through their vox grillies. Yet the reassurance rang hollow, for nothing tangible had materialized to justify the growing terror. It was fear without form until the first ship drifted in from the void. It appeared near the orbit of Vardosiv's second moon, a massive derelict silhouette illuminated only by the dim glow of the system's sun. The orbital auger stations detected it as a jagged mass of metal, crudely welded plates, and protruding engines that belched unstable radiation. No Imperial ship bore such a monstrous outline. The Void Station crews watched in stunned silence as the hulk rotated slowly, revealing paint smeared across its hull in crude symbols that no translation software could refine. But every soldier recognized instinctively. Jagged glyphs, blood-red streaks. The rough, brutal shape of a crude roaring mouth. It was an Ork creation. Panic erupted across the system. Alarms screamed through the orbital stations until the Vox speakers shook. Servitors spasmed as corrupted Auspex data overwhelmed their circuits. Officers scrambled to transmit warning messages to the planet below, but most were swallowed by static. Those that reached the surface came through fragmented and distorted, as though the universe itself struggled to articulate the scale of the threat. Down on Vardos 4, workers abandoned their tasks mid-shift, and soldiers sprinted across the fortress grounds as klaxons bellowed from every loudspeaker. The first official warning crackled through city-wide voxcasts, the governor's voice trembling beneath the distortion. He spoke of a foreign intrusion, urged calm, and insisted that reinforcements from a neighboring system were already en route. But his words dissolved into static halfway through his broadcast as a deeper, far more primal voice overpowered the frequency. The single guttural roar that replaced the governor's speech was not meant for language. It was emotion made sound, raw hunger for war, and it echoed through every voxcaster on the planet. War. Some civilians collapsed to their knees in terror. Others fled through the streets in chaotic waves. Soldiers slammed fresh power packs into their lascans, their hands slick with sweat. Tech priests hurried to fortify the energy shields around critical facilities, though many already flickered from overuse and neglect. Entire districts plunged into darkness as the strain overloaded their generators. The air itself trembled with a violent pulse that no instrument could fully measure. Astra Militarum commanders formed defensive lines around the capital city, directing regiments into trenches that had not seen use in decades. The smell of burning promethium filled the air as tanks rolled into position, their engines coughing smoke into the sky. Artillery crews loaded their first shells, their movements robotic with fear. Everyone soldier, priest, worker, child knew that the Greenskins never traveled alone. If one ship had arrived, countless others would follow. And they did. One by one, more Ork vessels tore into real space above Vardo's fall, each one more monstrous and violently engineered than the last. Some resembled cracked asteroids bound together with metal plates. Others looked like flying fortresses bursting with guns' engines, and ramshackle turrets that sparked with unstable energy. Their arrival shattered the calm of the void, filling the orbital space with a chaos that overwhelmed every Imperial augur. The first barrage came without warning. The Ork ships opened fire in a cacophony of roaring cannons, and the orbital defense platforms erupted into debris within minutes. Flames spiraled through the void like ribbons of fury. Exploding hulls illuminated the darkness with brief, tragic flashes. Imperial crews screamed into their failing voxlinks as pressure ruptures hurled them into the cold vacuum. Those on the planet below watched as streaks of fire carved through the sky falling. Wreckage of their orbiting defenses, the bombardment intensified. The Greenskins fired indiscriminately, their shots hammering the planet's surface with catastrophic impact. The capital city shook under the barrage. Towers buckled. Roadways cracked like brittle bone. Entire manufacture collapsed in plumes of dust and flame. Civilians ran through the choking smoke as soldiers shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of destruction. For many, the first real sight of the Orks came when the drop barges burst through the cloud layer. Massive, rusted, and shaped like crude metal coffins. They slammed into the ground with enough force to shatter stone. The doors blew open, and from the smoking interior surged the green tide. Orks charged into the streets with thunderous steps, bellowing as their boots smashed through broken pavement. Their weapons crude, oversized, and impossibly powerful fired bursts of energy that tore through armor plating and vaporized stone. Their laughter echoed like a sickening chorus, mixing with the screams of those who could not escape. They fought with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy. Every swing of their blades sprayed blood across walls. Every blast from their guns sent soldiers flying. They grew louder, stronger, more energized with each kill. Feeding on the violence as though it was sustenance, the Imperials resisted with desperate fury. Laskan fire streaked through the smoke, carving brief lines of red light across the battlefield. Tanks fired their cannons, sending shockwaves through the streets. Flamers roared from defensive lines, engulfing charging Orks in pillars of fire. Yet the Greenskins did not slow. They crashed into defensive formations with brutal force, smashing vehicles aside and tearing through infantry squads with unstoppable momentum. Within an hour, the first district had fallen. The holding lines broke. Vox transmissions dissolved into screams. The Greenskins surged deeper into the city, their numbers swelling with each wave of drop barges that slammed into the surface. Buildings burned. Civilians scattered. Soldiers fought until their ammunition ran dry, then fought with bayonets, then with fists, then with whatever they could grasp. The war had truly begun, and as the smoke rose into the sky, mingling with falling debris and spreading flame, the survivors learned a truth that would shape the fate of every world in the sector. The Orks were not invading one city. They were not attacking one planet. This was the first roar of a storm that would sweep across systems. Crack sectors opened like eggshells and drowned the galaxy in green fury. The war had woken and nothing would ever be the same. The dawn that followed should have brought light, but instead it crawled over the horizon with a sickly pallor, as though the sun itself hesitated to shine upon the broken world. Smoke blanketed the sky in twisting ribbons that glowed with an unnatural hue. Every rising column of ash shimmered green at the edges, catching the faint glimmers of alien energy discharging from the Ork weapons that still cracked across the ruined districts. Even the clouds seemed poisoned by the presence of the invaders, churning in thick, tumultuous patterns that mirrored the chaos unfolding below. Vardosva no longer felt like a world belonging to humanity. It echoed with a new rhythm, a violent, pounding cadence that seemed to beat in time with the heavy footfalls of the orcs, who now swarmed through its dying streets. Each explosion shook dust from shattered buildings. Each roar reverberated through broken windows. In these moments, the survivors realized they were breathing air transformed by the presence of the Greenskins, an atmosphere tainted by the raw psychic energy of the Waaagh itself. Soldiers who had survived the night staggered into new defensive formations with hollow eyes. The once organized lines had been reduced to scrambled clusters of exhausted fighters, clinging to alleyways, burnt-out storefronts, and hastily welded barricades that looked more like desperation than strategy. Officers barked orders that cracked with fear, their voices struggling to compete with the constant tremor of distant detonations. Medics sprinted between fallen comrades whose blood had already mingled with the chemical runoff from ruptured manufacturer tanks. The metallic scent of promethium hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of scorched earth and smoldering flesh as the morning grew heavier. The Greenskins intensified their assault. Their roars echoed from the ruins like a storm gathering momentum. Through clouds of drifting ash, their massive silhouettes appeared, brutish shapes outlined by the shimmering aftermath of energy blasts. They walked with the confidence of predators, certain their prey had nowhere left to run. Every movement they made felt exaggerated by the echoes that ricocheted through empty corridors and abandoned squares. Even a single orc bootstep seemed loud enough to shake loose the last remnants of sanity. From those hiding nearby, civilians huddled in underground bunkers where the glow globes flickered with every tremor. Families pressed together beneath emergency blankets, unable to silence the whimpers of frightened children. Administratum clerks clutched data slates filled with evacuation protocols that had become utterly meaningless. Priests murmured broken prayers to the emperor, their once steady voices cracked and uncertain. At every whispered litany, dust drifted from the ceiling as the thunder of distant battle rattled the walls. No holy ritual could drown out the sound of a rising Waaagh above the surface. Streaks of green light tore through the sky as orc aircraft descended in roaring torrents. Their crude designs defied every principle of aeronautics known to the Imperium, yet they maneuvered with an aggressive, impossible agility. They dipped low over the city, firing bursts of unstable munitions that left trails of glowing vapor in their wake. Each strafing run carved fresh scars through the streets, turning defensive lines into tangled heaps of metal and ash. Whatever semblance of calm remained shattered, as entire platoons disappeared in blinding flashes of green fire. The Astra Militarum attempted to answer with anti-air batteries, perched upon half-collapsed rooftops. Their cannons spat hot streams of tracer fire into the clouds, illuminating the sky like angry constellations. Some shots found their marks, ripping through the jagged wings of orc fighters and sending them spiraling into the ground as flaming wrecks. But for every aircraft that fell, 3 more screamed across the horizon, engines belching smoke and fury. The defenders could not reload fast enough. Their ammunition stores dwindled. Their machines overheated. Their gunners collapsed from exhaustion, hands trembling too violently to maintain accuracy. In the streets below, armored columns attempted a push to regain lost ground. Chimeras rumbled forward with their hulls blackened from the previous night's bombardment, each one carrying squads of infantry who clung to their weapons with white-knuckled desperation. Lehman Russ tanks followed in tight formation, their cannons thundering as they unleashed explosive shells that tore through advancing mobs of orcs. For a moment, hope flickered, the brief illusion that discipline and armored might could stem the tide. But the Greenskins answered with savage joy. A massive orc machine lurched through the smoke, its hull covered in welded plates, glyphs daubed in blood, and spinning saw blades that roared with mechanical hunger. It barreled toward the armored line with reckless speed, bullets pinging from its hide as if the tank crews were firing sparks at a charging beast. The thing collided with the lead Lehman Russ, its ramshackle drill tearing into the tank's armor. Metal shrieked, sparks exploded, and the tank's hull crumpled like soft clay beneath the monstrous assault. The crew inside barely had time to scream before the machine's saw blade tore through them, showering the street with a spray of burning debris. The sight broke the armored line. Chimeras swerved to avoid the wreckage, only to crash into each other in the chaos. Infantry spilled out into the open, scrambling for cover. The Orks surged after them, firing their weapons in explosive bursts and hacking down those who stumbled. Their laughter rose into the air, a violent symphony that contrasted brutally against the cries of the dying. They reveled in the carnage, feeding on its energy, growing bolder with every kill dot by midday. The sky itself had changed. It glowed with a pulsating green haze that radiated from the heart of the Ork fleet above. The sheer psychic presence of the war twisted the atmosphere, warping light and bending sound. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the ground. Air currents shifted in strange, irregular patterns, carrying the scent of burning oil and blood from one end of the city to the other. Even the sun looked different, dimmer, distorted, as though it strained to pierce the maddened veil the Greenskins had cast across the world. The survivors understood then that they were witnessing more than a simple invasion. This was not a mere military assault, nor the chaotic slaughter of a random warband. The Greenskins were moving with purpose, with unity, driven by a will so powerful that it imposed itself upon the very fabric of reality. The Waaagh was not merely a force, it was a presence, a storm, a thought shared by millions of minds beating in feral unison. Far off in the ruins of a toppled hab block, a small group of soldiers took shelter beneath fallen concrete slabs. Among them lay Corporal Rin Hale, her uniform torn and stained with soot. She pressed her back against the rubble, breathing shallowly as she tried to calm the tremor in her hands. Every explosion sent dust raining down upon her shoulders. Every distant roar made her heart hammer harder against her ribs. She could feel the psychic pressure in the air like a physical weight pressing in on her skull. Around her, the survivors whispered fragments of terror. Some spoke of Orks tearing tanks apart with their bare hands. Others swore they had seen Greenskins growing larger mid-fight, inflated by the raw thrill of battle. One soldier claimed he had watched an Ork weird boy unleash a blast of crackling energy, so powerful it vaporized an entire squad in a single green flash. Whether these were truth or hallucination, no one dared to question. Reality itself felt too fragile to scrutinize. A sudden tremor rippled through the ruins, accompanied by a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the very stones around them. The soldiers froze. Rin pressed a trembling finger to her lips, urging silence. The roar came again, louder, closer, heavy with the unmistakable cadence of greenskin amusement. Dust trickled from the cracks above. Rin exhaled slowly, praying the Ork would pass without noticing their hiding place. But Orks were not predators of subtle habit. They did not sniff the air or creep cautiously. They announced themselves with pride, with violence, with the kind of reckless certainty that came only from creatures who had never learned the meaning of fear. The sound of heavy boots struck the rubble. The debris shifted. Something massive pushed aside a slab of stone as though it were a sheet of parchment. A huge silhouette towered above them, green skin stretched over bulging muscle, jagged iron teeth glinting in the dim light, eyes burning with feral glee. The Ork inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of terrified prey. Rin reacted before she could think. She raised her lascan and fired point blank into the creature's face. The shot burned a hole through its skull, and the Ork collapsed backward with a thunderous crash. The impact sent cracks racing across the floor of the ruin, and dust filled the air in choking clouds. The soldiers coughed, scrambled, pushed themselves upright. Then they heard it. A new roar. Then another, and another. The death of one Ork had summoned a chorus of fury, dozens, perhaps hundreds, answering the call with excitement. Their silhouettes emerged through the swirling smoke, their weapons raised high. They crashed into the ruins with explosive force. Rin and the surviving soldiers fired until their power packs burned hot. They ducked behind shattered pillars, sprinted between crumbling walls, and fought not for victory, but for one more breath of life. Lascan shots lit the ruins like stuttering lightning. The fall of Vardo's fort did not remain an isolated tragedy for long. Word of its collapse traveled unevenly, carried through fragmented osteopathic messages that flickered with psychic distortion. Every transmission was broken, incomplete, a chorus of terrified echoes rather than structured reports. Some messages carried screams, Others carried the faint static of overwrought psychers, whose minds had cracked under the intensity of the Waaagh. A few arrived as nothing more than pulses of raw emotion, fear, despair, resignation, impressions so strong they infected the minds of those who received them. Sector Command deciphered what they could, piecing together a picture that grew darker with every new detail dot at first. High Command attempted denial. Administratum overseers insisted that Vardosva had always been unstable, that its fall could be attributed to internal rebellion, or Xeno's raiding forces exaggerated by terrified civilians. The governor of the neighboring system refused to believe the Greenskins had launched anything beyond a minor incursion. In the grand scheme of Imperial warfare, Orks were a constant nuisance, brutal, dangerous, but rarely unified enough to threaten an entire region. But then the Second World went silent, and the Third, and the Fourth. Ships bearing the crude markings of Ork warbands were reported near the trade routes of the outer systems. Merchant vessels fled into the void, transmitting garbled distress signals before disappearing into the darkness. Patrol fleets encountered Ork mobs drifting inside hollowed asteroids that had been turned into ramshackle void fortresses. The Greenskins no longer drifted aimlessly, nor did they roam in scattered bands. They moved with cohesion, with rhythm, with the terrifying unity of a storm front sweeping across the stars. The first officers who grasped the truth did so reluctantly. A fleet commander stared at his holomap with disbelief as system after system blinked red, overwhelmed by incoming Ork signatures. His adjutant suggested a recalibration, insisting that no Ork invasion could escalate at such speed. But the commander recognized the pattern, not of chaos, but of momentum. Something had fused these scattered greenskin warbands into a single, rising force. A war of such intensity that reality bent around it. Sector Command attempted a response, though every protocol seemed brittle against the scale of the threat. Orders crackled across the void, summoning Astra Militarum regiments from nearby systems. Mechanicus priests began requisitioning supplies for rapid deployment. Naval ships were instructed to gather at pre-designated rally points, but the preparations unfolded with painful slowness. Administratum bureaucracy moved like rusted machinery, clogged with contradictory reports and spiraling panic. Entire regiments were deployed to the wrong systems. Supplies vanished into the void due to mislabeled cargo. Transports arrived days late or not at all. And looming above every logistical failure was the growing realization that the Greenskins were spreading faster than the Imperium could respond. The Orks attacked with a ferocity that defied every expectation. On Malta's Prime, they descended through the storm clouds like falling meteors, their drop barges slamming into the manufacturing districts with such force that the ground buckled. The local defense forces barely had time to activate their sirens before the streets erupted in explosions and green-skinned monsters tore through their first defensive lines. Entire platoons vanished beneath waves of roaring Orks who fought with reckless joy, feeding on the chaos as though each kill amplified their strength. On Targo's 7 orbital stations detected an incoming fleet of crude warships moving at impossible velocities. Tech adepts called the readings errors. Vox officers ordered recalibrations, yet the ships continued to accelerate, their engines glowing like molten suns. The defenders barely managed to fire a single salvo before the Orks rammed through the orbital perimeter, shattering defense platforms and hurling debris toward the planet. The Greenskins boarded the system's primary void station through breaches torn into its hull, slaughtering every crew member in their path. By the time the station detonated from internal meltdown, the Orks had already launched their ground assault across the sector. Worlds flickered out like dying candles. Vox relays crackled with desperate calls for aid. Colonies vanished before reinforcements could even leave orbit, and the Imperium's attempts to coordinate a unified response crumbled beneath the weight of confusion and fear. Inside the cold heart of Sector Command, surrounded by walls of reinforced adamantium and lines of humming cogitators, high-ranking officials gathered in a war chamber illuminated by flickering projectors. Maps filled the air in glowing holographic grids, each one displaying a different region under assault. Red glyphs representing Ork fleets swarmed across the projections like a spreading infection. The officials stood in tense silence, their expressions carved from stone, their robes heavy with the weight of duty and despair. Lord General Corvain spoke first. His voice carried the authority of decades spent crushing rebellions and leading campaigns against Xeno's forces. Yet even he could not conceal the strain in his tone as he reviewed the data that scrolled across the holoslate in his hands. He described the pattern of attacks, the speed of expansion, the unsettling unity among the Greenskin warbands. His conclusion was as simple as it was horrifying. The Waaagh was growing in strength at a rate that defied logic. The Greenskins are not advancing as raiders, he said quietly, staring at the projections with a hollow gaze. They are advancing as a tide. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some protested that such a conclusion was impossible, that Orks lacked the discipline for coordinated warfare. But the evidence left little room for debate. Reports from surviving commanders described Orks fighting with a bizarre, instinctive cohesion. They adapted tactics. They seized territory with deliberate strategy. They constructed fortresses at an alarming pace. Fortresses that defied physics as much as common sense. The Waaagh was feeding on itself, growing stronger with every battle, every death, every scream. An Adeptus Mechanicus Magos stepped forward, her megadendrites twitching with agitation. She explained that the Orks were not merely increasing in number. Their crude machines were evolving. Engines roared with newfound power. Weapons discharged bursts of unstable energy that tore through armored vehicles with disturbing ease. Some Ork constructs displayed warp-infused anomalies, bending Auspex readings and disrupting Imperial targeting arrays. The machines themselves seemed to thrum with the psychic pulse of the Waaagh, as though fueled not by Promethium but by belief. Her voice distorted on the last word, the metallic rasp of a vox modulator unable to mask the tremor beneath it. The room fell silent as her statement echoed through the chamber. Belief. The Greenskins believed in their war, and in their belief, they shaped reality. A chill ran through the officials assembled there. If the Orks' unity and machinery were amplified by their collective warlust, then stopping them would require more than military might. It would require breaking the very momentum of the Waaagh, a task few commanders had achieved in recorded history. The larger the Waaagh grew, the harder it became to halt. And this Waaagh had already swallowed half a sector. Decisions were made with urgency that bordered on panic. Reinforcement fleets were commanded to abandon protocol and prioritize speed over safety. Astropaths were driven to the brink as they transmitted pleas for aid to neighboring sectors. Forge worlds were ordered to increase production, even at the risk of reactor overloads. Entire regiments of Astra Militarum were mobilized from distant star systems, their final destination unknown even to their commanders. But the Waaagh moved faster. Ork fleets appeared in systems where no warp signatures had been detected. Greenskins boarded Imperial ships by smashing through hull plating, ignoring vacuum and fire alike. Supply convoys vanished into debris fields that drifted through the void, like graveyards made of twisted metal. Even the navigators reported strange distortions in the Imperium, as if the warp itself echoed with distant, mocking laughter. Fear spread through the ranks of Imperial officers like infection. Some suspected the Greenskins had found a way to manipulate warp currents. Others believed the rumors that circulated in terrified whispers, that a single war boss had risen above all others, a monstrous figure whose will pulsed through the Waaagh like a heartbeat. That this war boss, whoever he was, had unified the Greenskin tribes with vision instead of randomness, that he pursued not simply war, but destiny. These rumors could not be confirmed. They could not be denied. The Imperial commanders knew only one truth. The Greenskin tide was accelerating. By the time the remaining loyal forces gathered in what the Imperium called the Orphean Line, a makeshift defensive line, stretching across 3 battered star systems, the Orks had already broken through half of it. The battlefields that emerged along this line were nightmarish landscapes of burning moons, derelict void stations and fragments of worlds shattered by orbital bombardments. The defenders fought not for victory, but for time to evacuate civilians, time to regroup, time to breathe. They gained little. Every hour brought new reports of systems overrun, outposts crushed and reinforcements lost in transit. Even the entrance of the Imperial Navy faltered beneath the relentless green storm. Commanders watched their fleets shrink with each engagement. By the time Imperial Command finally accepted that the sector was collapsing, the Greenskins had already begun telling stories about it. They did not record data, log tactical maneuvers, or file reports. They carved memories into metal plates, shouted them over roaring engines, and painted them across the hulls of their ships in crude glyphs that bled red, black, and yellow. Where the Imperium saw a series of strategic failures, the Orks saw something far simpler and far more intoxicating. They saw the beginning of a great story. They saw the work of a war boss worthy of legend. Out in the void, aboard a ship that should never have flown by any sane standard, a vast Ork war boss sat upon a throne of welded scrap and looted trophies. The chamber around him rattled with every course correction, every engine surge, every distant impact from the occasional bit of debris that dared graze the hull. The air smelled of oil, burnt powder, and something like scorched meat, flickering. Lumen strips, stolen from some forgotten human vessel and haphazardly nailed into the ceiling, cast a jagged light across the crude banners that hung from the bulkheads. Each banner bore the same symbol, a roaring fanged more beneath a rough crescent that might have once been a human aquila, torn and bent until it resembled something more pleasing to Ork eyes. The symbol was painted again and again in smeared layers, as if repetition alone could hammer it into reality. The glyph of war boss Gorzag's skullcrumper. He was vast even by Ork standards. Thick cords of muscle bulged beneath scarred green skin. His massive frame draped in plates of scavenged armor, etched with kill marks. Human helms hung from his belt. A space marine pauldron was bolted to one shoulder, and a cracked servo skull was chained to his throat like a mock pendant. His jaw was reinforced with metal, sharp tusks capped in iron, and one eye glowed with the dim red light of a stolen bionic. The other eye burned with something far more dangerous, the unshakable certainty that the galaxy existed to be smashed apart in his name. Around him gathered his nobs, each one a hulking brute in his own right, armored and armed with a patchwork of looted weapons made deadlier by crude Ork tinkering. They argued, laughed, and headbutted one another as they recounted the latest conquests. Every tale ended the same way, with Gorzag at the center, roaring louder, hitting harder, tearing down something the Humies had thought unbreakable. An Ork mech boy shambled into the chamber, his back bristling with mechanical appendages and sparking tools. One of his bionic arms crackled as a live wire brushed against his crude armor, sending a shower of sparks across the deck. He ignored it, stomping closer to the throne with the swagger of one who believed the ship moved not because of engineering, but because he said it should. Boss, he grunted, the word half swallowed by his jagged teeth. Dem Humie ships is running again. Day's pulling back. Dat means Day is scared. Gorzag's single organic eye narrowed, and then his mouth broke into a wide, brutal grin. He shifted on his throne, the metal groaning beneath his weight, and leaned forward until the mech boy flinched instinctively. Good, the war boss rumbled. His voice seemed to vibrate the plates bolted to the walls. Day run, we chase, Day hide, we smash DA place, Day is hiding in. Day scared, that means DA wires getting louder. The knobs roared in agreement, banging fists and weapons against the floor. The sound reverberated through the ship like a drumbeat, carried into the corridors where boys brawled for fun, where Gretchen scurried with armfuls of stolen gear, and where weird boys twitched and muttered in corners, their minds crackling with green lightning no one dared fully understand. Beyond the hull, the fleet spread like a jagged crown across the stars. Ships of every shape and size drifted in loose formations, hulks patched together from looted wrecks, asteroids fitted with engines, captured Imperial vessels defaced, with Ork glyphs and bristling with extra guns welded at insane angles. Engines flared, guns barked in random test firings, and jagged prows glowed faintly where void shields pulsed with unstable energy. The Greenskins did not move with the precision of the Imperial Navy, but they moved together, pulled along by the same irresistible instinct. Their Waaagh was not just expanding, it was cohering around GHO or Zagdot in the minds of his boys. He was already more than a war boss. He was an idea, a story they told each other between battles, a name they shouted in the middle of combat, a figure they believed could not be killed by anything as small and unimpressive as a bullet. They told each other how he had torn apart a chimera with his bare hands, how he had headbutted a sentinel so hard its cockpit imploded, how he had survived standing on the outside of a ship during warp translation because he wanted to see what DA inside of DA sky looked like. None of them questioned whether these stories were true. In the strange logic of Ork belief, the more they told such tales, the more real they became, and somewhere, deep in the warp-tangled threads that wound between their minds, that belief gathered like pressure behind a dam. Weird boys felt it most keenly. They twitched whenever Waaagh walked past, their eyes rolling back as they saw flashes of futures made of fire and iron. Some gibbered about worlds split in half by the war boss's blows. Others hissed about stars going dim as his fleet passed. Grot orderlies shackled them when the visions grew too wild, but their mutterings seeped into the rest of the Waaagh all the same, feeding the myth. "He's gonna crump a whole sector," one boy would mutter, tying another trophy to his weapon. "No," his companion would reply with eager conviction, "he's gonna crump DA Galaxy." From there, the stories only escalated docked far away. Imperial savants and tacticians sat hunched over flickering hololith projections, tracing the path of the Ork advance. They saw a growing pattern of conquest, a central knot from which the blows fell hardest. They marked the core of the Waaagh with tactical symbols. They gave it a code name, catalogued it in data systems, and attached it to reports that would cross stellar distances. None of them knew the name the Orks used, but they felt the weight of that name all the same. Wherever Waaagh led the war, the fighting took on a different quality. It was not merely more brutal. All Ork wars were brutal, but more focused, as if a single, crude will had aligned the normally chaotic instincts of the Greenskins. They launched raids not just for immediate slaughter, but to capture things, fuel, guns, ships, anything that could expand the reach of their war. Forge worlds found their orbital perimeters. Targeted first, their void defenses smashed with savage determination. Ork boarding parties broke through their shields and stormed their docks with one objective: seize the biggest engines, the loudest guns, the most explosive devices. Weird boys convulsed with glee when they stood in the shadow of god machines and titanic artillery, feeling the potential for carnage thrumming in every sacred corg. On one such world, a towering warhound titan staggered through the smoke of its own burning city, its princeps screaming defiance through the mind link as Greenskins swarmed across its legs. Like insects, they clung to armor plates hacked at, exposed joints, and planted explosives in maintenance hatches. The Titan's weapons roared, turning avenues into molten trenches, but the Orks only laughed louder when the final explosion tore its knee joint apart, sending the war engine crashing to the earth. The Greenskins cheered until their throats bled. News of the kill reached Waagh's ship in the form of a rambling, excited vox shout from one of his lieutenants. The war boss listened, grinning wider with every garbled word, then stood from his throne and roared so loudly the bulkheads rattled. "They knocked over 1 big walkie guns," he bellowed. "That's proper, dat is, see? Da humies think dey's big and tough, but dey all falls over DA same when DA Waaagh hits M." The boys nearby took that statement as revelation, repeating it to each other until it solidified into doctrine. The bigger the enemy, the louder the war needed to be. Simple, perfect logic. Tanks, titans, fortresses, star forts, all of them, in Ork eyes, were no more than invitations, challenges, things that needed to be knocked down just to prove they could be. Imperial commanders, watching their proudest war machines vanish into Ork-held territories or collapse in flames, failed to grasp the metaphysical layer beneath these events. They saw tactical decisions, supply line pressure, logistical sabotage. They did not feel the growing psychic pressure that coiled tighter each time a greenskin mob shouted Waagh's name before charging into battle. On some worlds, survivors claimed that the Orks fought differently under his banner, more than one. Guardsmen swore that bullets seemed to glance away from Gorzag's armor, where they would have pierced another orc. Artillery meant to obliterate him instead tore ragged craters in the ground nearby, leaving him standing and laughing amid the shockwave. Those who fled encounters with his personal retinue described his presence as suffocating, as though the air grew thicker around him, heavy with the weight of countless unseen eyes. Astropaths, when they combed through the psychic afterimage of these battles, sometimes flinched at what they found. It was not the cold, alien hunger of chaos, nor the sterile scrutiny of the Necron mind. It was a roaring, bellowing, stomping flood of emotion that crashed through their thoughts like a stampede. Joy, rage, hunger, exultation. The closest word in human tongues was zeal. The Orks believed in their war boss, and in believing, the collapse of the sector sent shockwaves far beyond the reach of any single astropathic message. Even fragmented transmissions, half choked by psychic static, carried a certain flavor of dread, a texture in the warp that navigators tasted before they saw it, a pressure that pressed against the minds of psychers, with a rhythm too close to a heartbeat to dismiss. It pulsed like something alive, something vast, something laughing. No imperial doctrine had a name for it. Most dismissed it as simple warp turbulence born of mass death, the psychic echo of worlds burning. Others whispered that it felt different, heavier, not like sorrow or terror, but exhilaration and expanding, pulse of collective hunger and savage joy that radiated outward from the heart of the, while like ripples on black water. Rumor carried quickly among those who could sense such things. Superstition carried faster. Truth, as always in the Imperium, traveled last. On the holy world of Elyserix, a poor shrine moon orbiting a gas giant, pilgrims gathered in droves to pray for deliverance from the growing green tide. The air in the Grand Basilica tasted of incense and desperation. Thousands knelt beneath frescoes painted with scenes of the Emperor's triumphs, their whispers rising like soft currents of air that pressed against the vaulted ceiling. Some prayed silently, their heads bowed. Others wept openly. A few shouted praises with a fervor so intense it bordered on madness, and through it all, a single question echoed. Why had the Astronomicon pulsed so strangely? It had begun subtly, a faint flicker felt only by navigators, dismissed at first as a momentary disturbance, but then the flicker became a pulse, and the pulse, in the deepest moments of warp travel, took on a rhythm too irregular to ignore. Some navigators described it as a flutter like a candle fighting a breeze. Others described it as a throbbing pressure, followed by brief moments of thinning light. The most terrified among them refused to describe it at all. High aboard the battleship Imperial Dignity, Navigator Hierophant Caltry's mallow pressed trembling fingers against the engraved cradle of his third eye. Sweat beaded down his fragile skin despite the freezing temperature of his sanctum. The navigator's face, gaunt and pale beneath the shimmering folds of his gold-threaded robes, contorted as visions clawed at the edges of his perception. He saw the light of the Astronomicon, normally a steady, unwavering beacon, flicker once more, only for the span of a heartbeat. Then again. His attendants, masked and silent, stood at the edges of the chamber, their server lamps dimming each time his breath caught. They could not see what he saw. They heard only his strangled prayer. No, this is not the Emperor's hand. Something presses against his light. He staggered back, clutching a rail for support as a wave of raw psychic noise washed over him. It was the same noise he had heard for days, a distant roar, swelling in bursts, threaded through with the psychic resonance of savage exultation. The Waaagh, not metaphorically, not poetically, the raw psychic field of the Greenskins, surging like a storm across real space and warp alike. He could not decipher the meaning buried within that rising tide, but he could feel its direction. It spread like a stain toward the heart of the Imperium. When the navigator collapsed, his attendants rushed forward. They found him trembling, muttering, and weeping blood from his third eye. Elsewhere, the same terror unfolded in smaller rooms, aboard smaller ships. Navigators refused to enter the warp. Some clawed out their own eyes to silence the visions. A few, broken by fear, begged their captains to turn back, to flee anywhere, even into the darkness without the Emperor's light. The great beacon had not failed, but something gnawed at its edges, something that felt both distant and horribly close. Those who refused to believe blamed the Psykers. Those who believed deeply blamed everything else. The Imperial creed fractured under the strain of conflicting certainty. On Minara cities, pilgrims claimed the dimming Astronomicon was a test of faith, not weakness. On flood-battered hive worlds, preachers screamed that the Emperor was displeased. Some claimed the Greenskins were punishment. Others claimed they were the shadow of a greater war yet to unfold. The most dangerous whispers came not from the faithful, but from those who could sense the warp shifting beneath reality. Something is pushing against the Astronomicon. Something is echoing across the warp, loudly enough to drown prayer. Something is bending fate. Something is laughing. Many dismissed these murmurs as wild superstition born of fear, but Psykers felt the truth more clearly. Their dreams filled with green storms, their meditations clawed with visions of roaring figures made of belief and war. Their waking moments pressed against an invisible weight that thrummed through their bones. In one sector capital, the last major bastion, still holding its void lanes, the Librarium Militum, struggled to interpret the signs. Dozens of Psykers sat cross-legged in chambers filled with incense smoke. Their eyes rolled back as they drifted through visions. Vox recorders captured their mutterings, which the savants tried to translate, though many words defied linear grammar. One mind, many minds, a tide, a storm walking upright, a voice that does not speak but still commands, fire across 100 worlds, engines roaring, stars dimming, a green crown, a fist that strikes the warp, a roar that pushes the Emperor's light aside for a heartbeat, a belief so strong it blinds. The savants deleted these transcripts as fast as they appeared, not because they were wrong, but because they might be right. Fear of contradiction was a powerful motivator. Fear of truth was greater. Across the sector, confidence in the Emperor's unshakable reach wavered. Not openly, no Imperial soul dared to voice such blasphemy aloud, but quietly, internally. In moments of stillness, soldiers stared at the dimming of their ships' gallowfields before translation. Officers flinched at shadows that flickered across the glow globes. Civilians wondered if the Emperor could truly hear their prayers across such distance, with so many worlds burning. But even as faith trembled, desperation grew. Aboard the refugee ship St. Paradian, Rin Hale sat strapped into a narrow bunk as the vessel lurched violently through half-stable warp currents. She clutched a small locket containing a fragment of metal, the last relic of Vardo's force she had salvaged before escaping its ruins. Down her! The ship vibrated with the screams of terrified passengers as the warp buffeted their hull. With unseen force, the gallowfield flickered, only for a moment, only once, but that was enough to send everyone into silent, collective terror. Rin stared at the flicker and felt something she hadn't felt, even during the final moments of her homeworld's fall. Not panic, not exhaustion, uncertainty. She wondered if the Emperor's gaze could truly reach them here, in a system drowning beneath a storm of greenskin power. In the bowels of the vessel, the ship's confessor shouted prayers into the intercom, his voice cracking with equal parts fear and conviction. He told the passengers the Emperor's light had not dimmed. They simply needed to hold stronger faith, stand firmer, pray louder. The louder his voice grew, the more he trembled. Faith could not quiet the growing truth. The warp itself seemed to pulse with green-tinted madness. The Waaagh was so vast, so unified, that even the Imperium groaned beneath its pressure. Somewhere deep in the void, Gorzag's skullcrumper roared in laughter as his fleet advanced. The sound rippled outward, a psychic thunderclap that made weaker Psykers gasp and clutch their temples. Every new conquest fed the tide. Every death fed the myth. Every Ork who shouted his name made the storm stronger. Imperial commanders received reports of warp anomalies increasing around Ork-controlled systems. Navigators swore that paths near the Waaagh moved unpredictably, as though pushed aside by a presence that had no right to influence the Imperium. Some likened it to turbulence, others to psychic thunder, but one navigator, near death and trembling, whispered the most chilling possibility before her heart failed. It is the roar of millions. Believing. That word, believing, spread quietly among officers and psychers, who understood the implications. Belief had power in the warp. It shaped demons, birthed nightmares, echoed through realms where thought and reality were intertwined. Normally, Orc psychic presence was chaotic, conflicting, scattered into countless tiny impulses, but this were pulsed with unity. A single rising beat, a single growing myth, a single war boss at its center. And with each world that fell, his storm grew brighter, louder, heavier dot in the shimmering halls of the Ordo Xenos outposts. Inquisitors stared at their data slates with the expression of those who had glimpsed the edge of something their doctrine had not prepared them for. Some spoke of containment, others of scorched earth purging. A few whispered forbidden possibilities, not that the Astronomicon was failing, but that something was pushing back. None dared say it aloud. Not yet. In the crowded halls of civilian ships, Rin Hale closed her eyes and listened to the prayers rising around her like a drifting fog. She did not know if the Emperor heard them. She did not know if anyone did. But she did know one terrible truth. The Greenskins' belief was louder, and their storm was only beginning. The first Forge world to fall did not die quietly. It screamed, not in the way a living creature screams, but in the way steel screams when forced beyond all tolerance, in the way reactors groan when pushed toward overload, in the way ancient machines, tended for millennia, cry out through Vox receivers as they tear themselves apart under impossible strain. The death of a Forge world is not a single event. It is a sequence of failures, each one cascading into the next like collapsing pillars in a temple older than memory. And when the war reached the forges of Galvan Capella, the collapse felt almost instantaneous. The world's surface burned with the glow of manufacture so vast. They formed entire continents of industry. Titans slumbered in cavernous vaults. Miles-long assembly lines produced Lehman Russ hulls with mechanical precision. Orbital docks held half-finished warships suspended in magnetic cradles. Everything on Galvan Capella existed for production, for war, for the Imperium's unending need for machines. When the first Orc ships pierced the void shields, everyone assumed the defenses would hold. Because they had to. Because the Imperium had no margin left. Because if the forges faltered, everything downstream would starve. But the Orcs did not attack with the scattered chaos of raiders. They came with monstrous purpose. In the control spires, tech priests chanted Binharic litanies as warning runes blazed across their data slates. The void shield emitters trembled with strain, lightning webbing across their surfaces as Orc macro cannon shells hammered them again and again. Each impact sent shockwaves through the planet's crust. Skittery cohorts formed up in perfect formations across the landing plains, their galvanic rifles raised toward the clouds. Cataphrons servitors rolled into position alongside Onager Dunek crawlers, their targeting arrays locking onto the Orc descent vectors. But the Greenskins dropped harder, faster. Heavier drop barges plummeted through the sky trailing fire. Some exploded before they reached the ground. Most hit like meteor strikes. Each impact sent a blossoming shockwave across the plains as Orcs erupted from the wreckage, in enormous numbers. Roaring with exhilaration at the challenge before them, the Skittery opened fire at once. Electric arcs tore through the first wave of Greenskins, charring flesh and blasting limbs apart. Onagers unleashed searing beams that melted armor. Icarus rays spat volleys of shells that shredded the Orc aircraft descending overhead. For a moment, a tiny, fragile moment, the defenders held. Then the Orcs answered. A colossal engine lurched over the horizon, each step shaking the ground. It looked like a titan built from scrap metal, rusted plates, and stolen reactor cores. Gears the size of hab blocks ground together behind its chest. Giant saw blades whirred on its arms. Exhaust stacks belched columns of green fire. Its head was a jagged metal skull with glowing red eyes, and a jaw large enough to bite a sentinel in half. A stomper. It fired the instant its shadow fell across the battlefield. The blast wasn't clean, nor precise. It was overwhelming. A river of molten metal erupted from its belly gun, reducing Skittery ranks to ash in seconds. The ground quivered as the machine let out a deafening bellow of mechanical laughter that was drowned only by the real laughter of the Greenskins. Swarming around it, the defenders broke. The Stomper waded through them, each swipe of its saw blades tearing open vehicles and slicing through rows of infantry. Cataphrone battle servitors charged it bravely, unleashing everything their heavy grav cannons could muster. But the shots only carved glowing lines across its armor. The Greenskins clung to its legs like parasites, banging on the plates with wrenches and hammers, fixing damage that only made it stronger. And behind the Stomper came more gargants, scrapwalkers, ramshackle artillery pieces dragged by engines that belched smoke so thick it darkened the sky. The Forge World's defense grid flickered. Then failed. In the manufacturer districts, servitors twitched erratically as psychic instability washed through the noosphere. Cranes malfunctioned and dropped their loads onto assembly lines. Titans in their vaults stirred as if sensing danger, their reactor cores humming with warning tones as alarms blared throughout their cradles. Princeps Aravian, bonded to the warhound Titan Lux Bellator, felt the tremor in the machine spirit the moment the Orks breached the outer wall. He snapped the mind link into alignment, merging his senses with the Titan's towering form. The world sharpened. Heat signatures flared. The distant roar of Ork machinery vibrated through his bones. Release restraints, he commanded, his voice echoing in the neural vault. Massive clamps detached. Hydraulic locks disengaged. The warhound stepped forward on burning limbs, its reactor humming like a heart preparing for battle. It strode into the chaos. The manufacturer gates burst open as Lux Bellator unleashed its first salvo. Twin Vulcan megabolters roared, cutting swaths through charging Ork mobs. Explosions lit up the horizon as the Titan advanced, its footfalls crushing Greenskins beneath tons of adamantium. But as the Titan marched, something far larger stepped through the smoke, a gargant. Towering over the manufacturer spires, its armor thick with plates scavenged from Imperial ships. Its eyes glowed with sickly light. Its arms bristled with weapons that pulsed with warp touched. Instability, the two machines stared at each other across a battlefield of fire. Princeps Aravian steadied the Titans. Stance. The gargant roared, and the two Titans of war collided. Metal slammed against metal with the force of collapsing buildings. The warhound fired point blank, ripping armor from the gargant's chest. The gargant answered with a blow that sent the Titan staggering backward, its right carapace plate denting inward. Orks swarmed the warhound's legs, hacking at pistons and cables. Skidry fired desperately, trying to clear the swarm, but the Greenskins clung with manic strength. Aravian felt the Titan stagger not just physically, but spiritually. The machine spirit screamed through the neural link, a howl of rage and pain that echoed through his skull. He pushed harder, urged the Titan to rise, forced its limbs to respond. But the gargant was too heavy, too loud, to be believed in. The Waaagh roared through the battlefield like a storm, and the psychic pressure of countless Greenskin minds surged into the gargant's engines. It burned brighter, hit harder, moved faster. The warhound faltered. The final blow came like a thunderclap. The gargant brought both of its massive fists down onto the Titan's head. The impact shattered the helm. The neural feedback ripped through Aravian's mind. Blood filled his mouth as the neural plugs overloaded. The warhound collapsed. The Orks cheered. The manufacturer fell. Across the Forge World, every machine screamed with it. In the orbital docks, Imperium crews tried to flee aboard half-finished vessels. Ork scrap fighters swarmed the docks, firing unstable rounds into engines and fuel lines. Explosions cascaded through the gantries. Giant cranes collapsed. The void shields flared, then shattered under direct impact as a kill cruiser rammed a docked cruiser. Bodies drifted into the void like discarded debris. The Orks looted everything: reactors, guns, engines, raw ore, Titans too damaged to fight but too valuable to ignore. Mechs cackled as they gutted manufacturer, ripping out sacred machines and stitching together abominations with 6 arms and no logic. Galvan Capella died in fire, smoke and stolen machinery. But the greater tragedy was not its fall. It was what came after. The Orks learned Each Forge world they conquered taught them new tricks, new machines, new engines, new weapons. Every Mechanica secret they cracked incorrectly, violently, nonsensically, somehow worked anyway. Powered by greenskin belief and warp-twisted momentum. Where the Imperium needed precision, the Orks needed enthusiasm. Where humans engineered with logic, greenskins engineered with desire. And their desire was endless. Within weeks, the war fleet doubled in size. Within months, it doubled again. The heart of the Imperium's war machine had been shattered, and the Orks had turned its corpse into fuel. In the dying light of the Forge world's burning atmosphere, one thing became clear: if the Imperium could not stop the greenskins here, it might never stop them at all.